Good morning, everyone. We are going to give everyone just another minute or two to go ahead and join into the GoToWebinar console. So if you will patiently wait with us, that would be great. All right, looks like everyone is joining in here. I see it now by the masses all at once. Everyone's coming in. So everyone's meeting reminder must have just popped up and everyone's jumping in. Perfect. Welcome to sunny San Diego. Hopefully some of you are at least down there. We would love to be, but instead we are continuing to work from home. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. It seems like we have a large portion of the people that have registered already logged in. So I want to be aware of everyone's time constraints. It seems like we have these days never-ending video conference calls that are all, for some reason, backed up one against the next. So we will go ahead and get started. I promised you 2 hours, so let's try to keep it within that time frame. Let me introduce myself for those of you who have not been on one of our California Trailblazer Series webinars quite yet. My name is Janae Dubois. I am the Executive Director of Growth Marketing for Shift3 Technologies. So for those of you who have not been on one of our webinars yet this year, we originally designed the California Trailblazer Series as a roadshow and had planned to come visit everyone in your respective cities throughout California in a 4-month period. Unfortunately, we're not in control of things, as everyone is quickly realizing. And so we had to pivot to a webinar series, which has actually been quite successful for us. We're meeting a lot of new people and are still able to do what our original intent was, which is in some way to help you as your Salesforce admins or whatever role you're playing within your organizations, to provide you with knowledge that you can hopefully immediately put to use to help increase user adoption amongst your org, increase efficiencies, or even perhaps getting Salesforce to work as you originally intended it to when you made the investment to utilize Salesforce. So each of our sessions are structured in the same manner. We will have a keynote speaker and we will have a training session, but each session is completely different in terms of the content. So if this is your first one, I highly encourage you to also consider the future webinars in this series, because you'll continue to get more and more information and hopefully value out of these. Today's session, we will be hearing from Jeff Scott, followed by a training session from Jacob Aguilar. After those two gentlemen speak, we will open up for a question and answers period. So if I can direct your attention to the GoToWebinar control panel, that should be on your screen. There is a questions portion of that control panel. And I want to encourage you at any point throughout this webinar, if you have any questions for either speakers or for Shift3 Technologies in general, please go ahead and use that questions console there. Those questions will come to me, and during that Q&A session, I will ask your questions of both Jeff and Jacob. Following the Q&A, we will have Amber Wood, Business Development Manager, focusing on Salesforce from Shift3 Technologies, give a quick overview of our company. And following her section, I would encourage you to stay till the very end, because we would like to send you a gift for attending today if this is your first one. So I would like to now introduce our keynote speaker. For those of you who have had the opportunity to attend our past Trailblazer series webinars, you may have heard this Jeff speak. This is actually part 3 of his series. This is all new information, brand new. So if you've heard Jeff speak in the past, you haven't heard this part. This is new, fresh content built specifically for all of you to hear today. So touting nearly 20 years of experience in exclusive Salesforce architecture, product development, and management consulting experience, Jeff has worked with countless companies on their success plans and complex implementation strategies. Jeff's client engagements have ranged from early stage startups to large enterprise implementations, leveraging the declarative side of the platform, along with a number of key AppExchange applications
more about
and
the 3,
custom
we
development.
just take a step back and look at our parent company, which is
Amber,
Bitwise
can you
Industries.
mute yourself, please?
Bitwise Industries is a technology movement that happened 7 years ago in the Central Valley, Fresno area.
Amber.
And the concept of Bitwise Industries was to bring technology to areas that were underserved to revitalize.
All right. Jeff's client engagements have ranged from early startups to large enterprise implementations, leveraging the declarative side of the platform, along with a number of key AppExchange applications and custom development. Jeff's unique micro-iterative approach allows him to create solutions that are simple in design, but highly flexible configurations that the customers can scale and maintain in a cost-effective manner. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you now, Jeff.
Good morning. Thanks, Janae. Good morning, everybody. Let me see if I can get my screen working this time, because I blew that the last time. Let's see here. Perfect. I am excited this morning to get to continue this digital storytelling series that I've been working on. And for those of you who have been through some of my work before, this is going to be a very kind of hands-on, iterative approach to solving some problems today that you guys deal with out of the box. But let me just do some things. As Janae said, I am really passionate about teaching and provoking outcomes and ways to actually implement Salesforce for you guys in the real world with problems and things that you guys are contending with every day. So teaching and mentoring and getting the opportunity to do this now at the college level and also in the field is definitely my passion. So I hope today you guys take away, and from any one of my presentations, that you take away things that you can go back to your job, to your environment, and actually start playing with and working with. So it's gonna be a lot of fun. This is gonna be one of my favorite topics today. You guys know me probably if you've been to my presentations, and I think this is now getting old. It is dated. It is my anti-safe harbor statement. I will challenge you, provoke you, and tell you to go crazy with as many things as you can find or use within Salesforce. I am retiring my anti-safe harbor statement, but I want to be clear. I am replacing it with my anti-sandbox development statement, which is in draft form. And I want to teach you guys how to do a lot of this work safely sometimes in a production environment or in a way that actually will speed up the process or cut costs and things like that. So before I just give you this statement and say don't use a sandbox, I brought something with me today. I brought the formula that I use to actually determine whether I'm at risk working in a production environment. So for any of you that can actually figure out what this formula is and what the results are, let me know, because I haven't been able to figure it out. So I kind of use this in my head. I just kind of count the number of users and how long have I been with a client or currently in my job to make sure I have security if I make a mistake. Salesforce experience, right? Of course, your mood and your attitude could be a huge improvement on whether you're at risk, all those kinds of things. But the reality is, a lot of the things that I will teach and show you guys and the techniques will allow you to work safely in a production environment. As some of you may cringe, but for 17 years or 16 plus years, I have been doing 90% of my work in a production environment and creating solutions that can be deployed in minutes, hours, and days by using this technique that we're going to learn today. So I don't want you to be reckless. I just want you to have fun and be mindful of when you can get things done rapidly as we move forward. As Janae said, there was chapter 1 and 2, and just kind of a little recap. In chapter 1 and 2, we took the out-of-the-box lightning page experience and went through and learned, what's important about being a digital storyteller, how to capture requirements, get to know your end users, master some of the tools that are prevalent in what you would be using every single day. And those recordings are available if you want to go back and watch those if you're new to this audience. But there's so much out of the box that we can take advantage of with Salesforce that if we just take the time to master the tools that are there, experiment with them, solve problems with them, we can really kind of take advantage of the out-of-the-box solutions to drive costs down or make a project much more easily understood by the end user, or you can speed up all kinds of automations and things and reduce code so that you're not having to maintain a really complex system. So I'm excited to get to move on today and talk about chapter 3, because there are some basic out-of-the-box types of solutions that are really needed to reduce complexity on the platform or eliminate data quality issues. But before you start solving these problems, the key is creating a methodology so that you can easily capture the requirements, iterate and put those out to the end user as fast as you can, getting their feedback and things like that. So today we're going to go over how I capture requirements, really get an understanding of what microiterative development is. I have a little bit of a personal religion or practice that I call 1-5 everything else that I teach. I'm going to get to share that with you guys today. I hope you get some benefit from that. And then we get right into the use case, which I'm excited about because I think a lot of us deal with this problem, which is how do we take the addresses and actually synchronize them between a contact and the accounts and then back down to the contacts again? And how do we do this in a way that we can deploy it in small chunks, creating value and solutions rapidly for the end user? So that's what we're going to dive into today. And a very hands-on section towards the end of this is going to be where I'm going to focus with you on building the actual solution live. Of course, this is always the challenge, right? I don't know if you guys have the same problem, but even I have the problem sometimes of not being able to actually provide accurate requirements because I don't necessarily know what I want. And I can tell you I've interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of end users and watched them work and heard their pain described, how they would see the solution being done. And it is just the most painful experience trying to get inside of that end user in their head and try to figure out those requirements. I have rarely met end users that could really articulate the technical requirements or the process requirements perfectly. And it's always that challenge. So I'm assuming you guys all have the same problem trying to get inside of the head of the user. And that's the key, is how do we do that in such a way that we don't get out of control and do these large iterations or large projects that end up creating waste or creating complexity that we didn't need. So first part of this is, how do we go about capturing these requirements? And it's gotten a little more challenging because we don't have the in-person meetings and the whiteboards and the conference rooms and the things that we've had in the past. So over the last couple of months, it's definitely pushed the envelope on how do we actually collaborate and how do we do things efficiently. But the reality is, and I just kind of ran into this the other day, is ironically enough, a pen and paper and a whiteboard, or taking a picture of something that you wrote down on a piece of paper and sharing that with somebody sometimes is a totally appropriate way to capture those things. So these are some of the tools that I use and the methods that I go about. But when I want to rapidly develop a process for somebody and I want to capture the requirements, I try to get on a phone call. I try to get their requirements married with what would make it successful. Is it easier data entry? Is it making sure that they don't make mistakes? There's all kinds of things that you need to figure out. One is the technical solution and the requirements side of it, but also how do you measure success? I think often we forget to do that so that we can actually make sure that the stakeholders and the users can actually see success and get excited about it. So I actually will do that. I often will record a web meeting, watching somebody work, capturing their requirements, seeing their Excel spreadsheets, seeing the manual processes that they're doing before I get into building the solution. The other thing that I do is I visually map the process when it's appropriate, or the data and technical architecture. And to be candid, some of my largest implementations, one that I'm working on right now, doesn't require an enormous amount of process mapping or technical diagramming or extra scope writing in this particular case. And so I'll show you kind of one of my favorite tools, Lucidchart here. And this is one of the projects that I've been working on. But I might start with an object model, and then I want to just break out the object model for how they actually want to organize their architecture. And as long as I can articulate a story visually and get them to kind of give me the semantics and the things that I need, I can actually take from this and actually start to iterate and build out a solution for them. And the nice thing is, when it's a net new implementation, a brand new Salesforce org, you don't have to worry about the sandbox. You can actually kind of build it live, iterate through it, test the data before you actually take it live and get a lot of that work done. So I use a tool like Lucidchart. Often I use GoToMeeting in that particular case to visually map and capture those requirements. And in this particular case too, I might actually use Salesforce.com as my digital whiteboard. So I will actually just go into Salesforce, especially if it's a new custom object or a new thing that is not being used by the users. I will use it to kind of sketch in what I'm thinking, put some fields together and capture the data just to make sure I'm getting the kind of gist of what those requirements are, and I'm able to go back and rapidly validate for the end user, is this what you're looking for in that case? And it doesn't require that I actually automate everything and code everything and make it perfect. It's about getting the requirements and validating them and making sure that they're good. Sometimes we do have to put together documentation or capture something digitally. In that particular case, for those of you that use and live in Chrome, I hope that is your life. I use a plugin called Awesome Screenshot to capture screenshots and images and do quick little annotations and things like that. So this is one of my favorite tools for capturing the process, called Awesome Screenshot. So it allows me to look at a screen, capture part of the page, the entire page, and things like that. And if I want to capture a selected area, because I just need to do this really quick, I can capture that. I can annotate and draw some things over the top of it, whatever that's going to be, and save that as an image and share it with somebody. So there's a number of free tools like that you don't have to deal with complexity of something like Lucidchart or other tools that will get you to the results you're looking for. So definitely check out Lucidchart or Awesome Screenshot. Those are the ones that I use the most. But at the end of the day, I actually spend a lot of time building my digital stories live in a Salesforce environment, trying to prototype and show them what it looks like. The key, though, regardless of how you gather requirements and document them and collaborate with those end users, is how we deliver this project, how we deliver the solution. And there's a lot of school of thought of waterfall and agile and a traditional methodology for delivering a project. But I have been obsessing over micro-iterative development and tasking of a project for years. And I try to break everything down into the smallest pieces. It could be, one day I taught a lecture with my team and I said, it could be that you just add 3 fields to the contact layout and get those live, because these end users are actually capturing data still in an Excel spreadsheet, and all they really needed was 3 fields. So it's not about, do I need to go out and capture 50 fields and get it all done in one big iteration and then cram it down their throat. I could actually just do a couple of fields and release that and kind of make that announcement, and they can start using the solution right away, eliminating a whole spreadsheet, for example, in that case. But the key here is micro-iterative development really does reduce cost. It really does take a lot of things out of the equation that I think get people into trouble on their projects. So definitely getting iterative feedback from your end users is important. You'd be surprised how often when you present something to somebody, a new page layout or a couple of new fields, or they just go in and add some data to it to test it, their perspective is constantly changing. So to give them a whole solution sometimes doesn't necessarily give you the results you're looking for, especially since we started with they didn't really do a good job describing what they wanted, or they didn't know what they wanted. So by taking them through this iterative process, we can eliminate significant project costs, spend a lot less time with them trying to get inside of their head, and ultimately reducing the risk of the solution. But I live and die by this 1-5 everything else methodology. And I will describe a story that was really telling to me one day when I kind of figured this out. I had a project where somebody needed to import 100,000 data records into Salesforce, 100,000 contacts to be exact. And that person basically built their file and imported it in using the data loader. Didn't see the results of that right away, so they thought, oh, it didn't work. So they actually just did it again. And next thing you know, we had 200,000 contacts with a ton of duplicates. In another situation, I had a person who started to import 2,000 records, and it started to actually blow up, and some records were imported and some were not. And what they didn't do is follow a basic process that I always follow, which is adding one record manually, then maybe adding 4 or 5 more complex records manually, making sure that the system can actually save the record and store the record, that the format of my data is correct. And then I start over again, and I will actually then import one record or import a handful of records. I never take a data set of 1,000 records or 2,000 records, or better yet, 100,000 records, and just import them in. But I use this kind of 1-5 everything else in a way that I structure my day, my week, personal life, getting my kids under control. It's a whole mindset of just taking small little chunks and actually building momentum and getting us moving. And that's really the heart and soul of delivering a solution like this in a micro-iterative format. So we can talk for days on this topic on how you do this, but I want to show you today how we tear apart a relatively complex problem that we are all pained with and build it and deliver it in a very iterative way. So I don't know if everybody has dealt with this, but probably from the day I started with Salesforce so long ago, I dealt with this particular problem out of the box. And that is that there is a lot of confusion around not only the names of the fields in Salesforce sometimes. So on the account object, there's a field called billing address by default. And then shipping address. So we have billing and shipping address, which, okay, I got that. And then we have on the contact, we have mailing address and other address. And this to me was very confusing because Salesforce naturally passes the data from the billing address down to the mailing address, but yet the maps and how I would drive and get directions is more in the mindset of the physical address or the street address in this particular case. And when we get inside of a problem like this and we try to make sure we understand what the problem is, because a user comes to us and says, hey, I updated the address and it doesn't make any sense. This went here and this went there, and they're just discombobulated in the way that they're presenting their problem. I get in and I'll actually go through this. So I've left you guys a little test, but you go through and enter a billing address, and then we enter a contact, and we realize that this address is actually naturally passed down to the contact into the mailing address. And that to me was a very confusing problem early on. And Salesforce, early in the days, came out with a feature called rename fields, tabs and fields in this case. And so one of the best practices and standards that I've come up with that I would challenge you guys to think about is just simply renaming those two fields that are mapped together to make it street address or physical address on the account and the contact, allowing us to have a shipping or mailing address or a personal home address or another address for the contact if needed. So I use these kind of as alternate or optional fields and rely heavily on the fact that if you're in sales or you need to go out and physically research where they're at or go visit somebody, you have the street address in this particular case. So to do that, we actually go over here behind the scenes, and let's go here. There is a feature called rename tabs and labels. If those of you if you've never used this before, it takes a little getting used to, but it's really kind of nice. Oops, let me do that. And we can actually take the account object and the contact object, and we can go ahead and edit that. We can change the name. People have often changed the name, like accounts to companies or accounts to businesses. But we go into here and we can actually come in, and these are the fields here. So you'll see that it's originally called billing address, and we'll go through and we'll rename the labels of those fields in this particular case. Now, it doesn't change anything from an API perspective, but where you could get into trouble is if you're using this in like a Conga merge document or a mail merge document, changing the labels of the fields could definitely get you in trouble. But the thing we do here is we go down and we say street address and street city. One of the little gotchas that was kind of funny is by default it says billing street, And so someone will put street on accident, and you'll end up in this funny little labeling problem. So just be careful with your labels, and I will provide this in the deck later with all the different field names that you would want to do for both the account and the contact object. So I'll go through and I'll actually rename those things so that when I'm looking at an account or I'm looking at a contact, there's no confusion. And this is kind of how I have it set up. I have a demo org or a dev org that is just Salesforce out of the box, so I can kind of see how they do it. So you can see that billing address and shipping address is here in this particular case. But when I go to add a new contact, it is actually passing that along. So that's the dilemma, is that we're out of the box, we're dealt sometimes these things that we need to fix, and users get confused. And so somebody comes along and says, hey, could you fix this for me? And so that's how I start doing this. I take the fields, I rename them, and then I actually use some other things too to make sure that I can see where the problem is and start solving this problem very quickly. So that's what we're going to get into. So step one is setting us up. We rename our fields. You don't have to do this, but it's important to think about it. And then I also use some other fields like an address mismatch formula field on the contact. And then I might use a Apex rollup. This is a little more complex. We'll get into that with the number of contacts on an account, which I wish was there out of the box, by the way, so that we could actually see, how many contacts are there and whether we actually have some mismatches in our data. So one of the things that I use here is this formula field on the contact called street address mismatch. And it's a really simple formula that basically says, tell me if the mailing address on the contact is different than the billing address on the account, and indicate that for me. And then what I do is I put it into a data quality contact list view, and it makes it really easy for me to see if I have a problem in my system, or measure if my solution ultimately solves the problem at the end of the day. So if I go back over to Salesforce and I look at that, I can look at the contacts tab. Let's go to the contacts tab. Oops, here we go. We'll go to the contacts tab here. And I might actually have a mismatch list view here that will pull out all the ones that are mismatched in this case. And so it'll tell me that all of these people here have addresses that don't match the account. So I can quickly see in a list view or in a report whether I actually have a problem. And in the past, I was taking the data out to Excel, trying to do complex evaluations and scrubbing it manually. And I'm like, oh, wait a second, why don't we just use a formula field? So that's one that you guys can use very quickly to see if those are matching or not, or if you do actually have a data quality problem that makes sense. So I'll leave you with that, and then definitely have list views and reports and things ready to go so you can see what the problem is. But the neat thing about it is, to fix the problem, if you've identified that this is a known issue, that if you update a contact's address, ultimately you would want it to go update the account's address if that's appropriate, and then have it update all the other contacts as well. And I actually just use Process Builder to do this solution with a couple of fields. And that's what we're going to build today and just kind of dive into, so you guys see how this iteration comes to life. So this is where we're going to dive in. We're going to get right into this and start building, because I want to talk about some best practices when we do automate the process, because I've captured the requirement, I've gone in and I've actually played with the solution, realizing what the pain of the end user is. I've seen how the data is behaving, so I definitely have my head around what do I need to do. I think I've identified how I can do this with the out-of-the-box kind of process builder routines, and the pain is there, and I don't want to wait for 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 3 months to deliver a whole solution. Could I actually start delivering a solution right away? And more often than not, you can deliver something that's good enough in the first iteration in this case. So imagine the first iteration. Imagine that I update the account's address to a new address. So a company moves, and suddenly I want to make sure that all the contacts are updated. Now, I don't know about you guys, but you could have 5 contacts, 2 contacts, or you could actually have 1,000 contacts, and nobody is going to want to go update all of those address fields for those contacts. Nobody wants to do that with Data Loader. Nobody wants to try to do it manually. It's a big ordeal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my first iteration using Process Builder without overthinking it, because the minute I can deliver this, it will start solving some of the data quality problems. And I'll show you how we do that. So we'll go back in here to Process Builder. And what I use as a best practice for my objects where I can, and that is I will have one process routine for the edit, save, changing of records, and another process routine for creating new records. And then I try to do all of my work inside of those. And so today we're going to work inside of the account process builder routine here and put that together to be able to solve this particular problem. So I'm going to do a version 2 so we can kind of build this live and you guys can see this solution come to life in this case. So I'm going to do my account. And this is the way I do my naming conventions, edit, save. And I'm going to do V2 just to separate the one that I already made for this. And we're going to say when a record changes, go ahead and start this process. And obviously we're working first on our first iteration, which is account. So I'm going to change the account address. So I'm going to do that. And then only when a record is created, no, because I definitely want to do it when it's created or edited in this particular case, and save. And in this instance here, we're going to definitely add a criteria. And I often will use, let's go behind the scenes here. I want to use my example that's already completed. So the nice thing about this is I'm going to leave you guys with the documentation and some screenshots and things on how you can actually build this yourself in this particular case. Oops. Sorry, 1 second. I'm in the wrong work. Hang on. Always helps if you actually have the right tab open. Sorry about that. So clearly working on the fly and doing this is difficult. So let's look at our version 1 here. And we'll use this. So I will use logical names for my nodes, and you guys can have up to 200 decision nodes in a single process builder routine. And I will give it a logical name in this particular case. So we're going to go ahead and call this one when the street address changes. So we have that. Here, we're going to say, great, when these conditions are met. No, in this situation, we're going to just fire this off and make it work. We're not going to worry about conditions for our first iteration because we know that when these things change, sorry, here, the street address changes, that we want it to actually fire in this particular case. So when we look at this and we look at our criteria, we're basically saying, hey, if any one of those street address fields changes, just fire this in these conditions and just get it to go. Because if I change the suite number, if I change the spelling of the state code or anything like that, I want to make sure that it pushes down to all of the contact records in this particular case. So I'll do that and I'll put all my criteria in here behind the scenes and making sure that I have that. And then I'll actually put my immediate action together as well. So this is definitely one of those things where after you've renamed the fields and things, you have to be comfortable with knowing where they are. So I definitely want to say if the street address has changed here, so I'll say is changed true, then go ahead and fire this off. And I'm kind of short-circuiting this. And then I actually do my update action in this particular case. And the nice thing about Process Builder that obviously is the step up from workflow rules in this particular case is that it can update records down below. So I'm going to go ahead and update the records here. So I'm going to update all of the contacts that are associated with that account. So I'm going to say a record related to the account here. And so then we will search for the contact object. So we have contacts. And here in my first iteration, I am not going to worry about all the advanced stuff that I can do. I'm going to just have it update every contact, assuming that every contact that I have associated with this account needs to have its address updated. And I know that that could actually get me in trouble in a bigger implementation that has some different setups and structure to the data. But in most situations, especially out of the box, that seems like a natural thing to do in this particular case. And so then here, I'm going to go ahead and update the street address field using the account street address field that I just changed. And I can actually add these fields in and get this all polished off. And the outcome in this instance looks something like this. So I have my object, I have my decision tree and my criteria of all the fields that have changed. And then ultimately I have my contact updating routine here, and I've got all my fields mapped to the account fields. And suddenly, every time I change the account address situation, then it will actually synchronize and push down to the contacts. And for me, in most conditions, this is a relatively safe routine to put out and assume it's going to clean up a lot of the data problems that you guys are having with your end users. Now, is it the ultimate solution? Is it everything that we need? No, but it is definitely an iteration that starts to add value in that case. And so then I would activate that and go ahead and go live with that after doing some testing, of course, to make sure that it works. And that's the other thing too, is that, you know, in my environments and how I've got them set up, I might actually have a test account. And in this case, in my demo org, I actually have a bulk test account that has 1,000 contacts in it, so that I can see that this is actually going to work in this instance. And so that's how we'll go about solving this problem very quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and activate my process here. And I'm going to go ahead and test right away that that is actually going to work. Now, whether I do that with 1,000 contacts because I want to see if it's going to handle that load, or I do it with a smaller number of contacts, it doesn't really matter. So in this situation here, I'm going to change the suite number on the account. And when I do that, it's going to now propagate and update all 1,000 contacts to have the same street address in that case. And now here's an example where Process Builder and the load on the system is going to kick in. It didn't take very long for that to occur. And then I'll go check my contact records that I actually have, and making sure that it actually did that. And so there's an example, if we look at it, of iteration 1. I just simply took the account address, any changes made to it, and mapped it down to the contact appropriate address. And suddenly I'm starting to be able to update things very quickly and not get into trouble. So that's iteration 1. And I have actually released a solution like that and called it good enough because there was a definite problem at hand. Now, we've given this to the end users and they come back to us and they say, well, here's my other problem. If I update, often I'm not updating the account address. I'm talking to somebody and I'm updating the contact address in this case. And I want it to not only update the contact when I'm saving it, but I want it to also go up and update the account address. And then I would assume that the system would be smart enough to then go down and actually update all the other contacts that are in the system as well. And so here goes iteration number 2. And the neat thing about that is that we can get back into Process Builder. Let's do that. And we can actually say, all right, well, what are we going to do there? Because now we have a situation where we're updating the contact address. So I have a couple of different versions here with the different iterations on them. But let's look at this version, version 1, and kind of tear it apart. Obviously, we have the contact object, and that's fine. And we've got a node that is logically named the same. So street address is changed. And we look at that, and it's very similar, saying if I've changed any one of these 5 fields on the address block, go ahead and fire this rule. And then it actually is going to update the account record in this particular case. And this is just basically the inverse of the first iteration. And now I'm actually moving a contact's address up to the account. Now, the neat thing about Process Builder, if it's done right, is that this secondary routine that I've done will actually fire off the first iteration's routine that I've done. And I've solved one of the biggest address synchronization problems that exists with Salesforce, which is being to move up and then down again in this particular case. So I'm going to take this iteration and I'm going to go ahead and activate that. And I'm going to go ahead and go back and test that and see kind of what that experience looks like in this case. So for that, we're going to actually use the Burlington example, or Jack Rogers is a better way to get to it. So we use Jack Rogers here from Burlington. And here's a situation where the address that I put together here is not mismatched, so it matches in this particular case. And this is this field that we talked about, the street address mismatch field. And so I'm going to go ahead and update the suite number to suite 400, because Jack informed me that I had the wrong suite number in this case. And so I do that. And what happens is it actually updates that there. It goes back up to the account, updates the address there, and then it actually updates the address of my peers in that particular case as well. So here you have an up and then a down scenario that works really well. So I should be able to see there that Suite 400. And so regardless of where I'm at, I can actually change the address now at the account or any one of the contacts, and it'll keep everything in sync. This to me solved a really painful problem that I've seen in many, many orgs when it comes to addresses and data synchronization. So you can use this technique in many different ways, as you can imagine, not just with addresses. So that is actually iteration number 2. But obviously we get into it, we deploy something like this, and along comes an end user who says, I know that we have 200 people working at XYZ company in Atlanta, but one of the employees works at a different location, a different building, or they work out of their home address, or something like that. And that becomes then the more challenging part of this is, how do we then deal with some of the more advanced iterations? So what you're seeing in this design is the fact that each iteration is building on the last one, exposing some of the requirements. It's not that I couldn't have gathered those requirements in the beginning, but maybe I didn't understand that that was a problem, or the end user wasn't able to articulate that as a problem, because I have never dealt with this before. So that's where I kind of get more excited about micro-iterative work, is that they then review what those problems are. Now, did they do a lot of damage to the database because we overwrote one person's address, things like that? Not necessarily. And then if you use some of the other tools out of the box, like field history tracking and things like that for the critical fields, you could definitely see any changes that accidentally occurred in that case, and you could always revert them back if it was really that big of a deal. So there's many different ways to deal with deploying iterations and dealing with some of the challenges that you come across using the tools that are there. This to me is actually where this thing becomes really fun, because now we can really solve the last piece of the problem with our third iteration. And the last piece of the problem is simply this. It's Mary has disclosed to me that she works at a different building or a different suite number, and I don't want her address to sync up and then push that to everybody else in that case. And so here's where I introduce a contact checkbox field called Do Not Sync Address. So I can actually check that off, and I can actually say, okay, she's in Suite 100, not in Suite 400 or 300 in that case. And when I do this, and I save that record, I'd want to make sure that it's not going up and actually changing all that kind of stuff. And so what I do there now is I go back to my process builder routines. Let's go back here. And let's look at the account edit save and the contact edit save. So in iteration 2, I could definitely put some other parameters in and criteria in and things like that that would be needed. But ultimately what I'm getting to is I want to make sure that when the contact address is updated and the account address is updated, so we're going here, that we don't actually accidentally sync, in this particular case, oops, here we go, contact addresses that have it checked. So all I have to do is I have to do one clone and one iteration on this routine, adding in the criteria that says do not sync address equals false. And that way, when I now update an account address or a peer's contact address, it doesn't go down and synchronize to those contacts in that particular case that have it marked as do not sync. So it's really kind of easy to put that into my routine so that if she's marked that way, when I go to change Jack's address or the account address, I don't get into trouble. So it's kind of fun to see how you can kind of iterate through this. And then you do discover some things like, well, wait a second, what happens if I uncheck her address, do not sync? And I do actually want to make a change in that particular case. What should the natural behavior be in this particular instance? So you do have to kind of capture for some of these different use cases in this particular instance, but that's okay because we can actually, in Process Builder, start adding more decision tree nodes in this particular case. And the last one, I think, here is going to be my contact one, and my very last iteration there allows me to have my normal one here to change it, but then I have one that says do not sync has been changed. And all I have to do is basically say, hey, if the do not sync box has now been unchecked, it's changed, and it now equals false, then go ahead and update the contact's address from above. So in this situation here, it's going to pull the latest address from above, and because Mary has told me that she's moved from suite 100 back to the corporate office of suite 400. And so I can basically start to put this iteration together and test it again. And when this one's ultimately activated, I get the best of all worlds. I get this ability to basically mark somebody with a manual address, uncheck it, change the address, and now I've got data quality euphoria, and all of my addresses are kept in sync up and down, even in bulk. In some situations, you might find that you outgrow it, but that's kind of what we get out of this. We get this incredible ability to iterate through and clean up little holes and problems with formula fields and checkboxes and things that just help us kind of figure out, do we even have a problem, or have we solved the problem? And we get to use Process Builder and things like that. And very rarely do we have to necessarily turn to code and extras in this particular case. That's what I enjoy about the micro-iterative side of this, is that I can do these in these smaller chunks. And there's a lot of different techniques, don't get me wrong. Like I said, to roll up things like the number of contacts. Maybe if I'm on a contact record, I want to be able to look at the account address and see it and change it here. So you can definitely even edit this from here. You could put this related chatter action on the sidebar, so you could look at the contact's address that says, do not sync, and the corporate address. You could introduce lightning components and visual indicators to say there's a sync issue or a data quality issue, or just alert your users that this person's at a different address. So don't forget that we can use a lot of the out-of-the-box features too to make the user's experience in the the fourth, fifth, and sixth iteration better. And we often will find or discover those things after we've deployed the first couple of iterations, and the end user basically tells us, hey, I would like it to do this, or could you make it easier to do this, or this isn't very visually pleasing. So that's the key. The key to this and building solutions with Salesforce and technology is to break it down into the smallest chunks and interact with your users and give them things to play with and give you feedback on in that particular case. And I do know that a lot of you have to work in sandboxes for good reason and get your users into there, but get them to actually interact with the solution that you're iterating on. Don't wait till the very end to find out that you over-engineered it or built something that wasn't what they were looking for, because that creates all kinds of confusion and cost and time to get a solution to market. So that's the fun of this. If you guys later have any questions, I definitely would love to hear them from you. I have a number of solutions like this that can teach the micro-iterative style, but this is the one that I teach for my college students, and it just really helps them understand the movement of data, the data quality issues, and some of the problems an end user deals with, and you guys as sysadmins and architects having to address with the solutions out of the box. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This is definitely one of my favorite things to do, to be able to kind of process automate all kinds of things with Salesforce out of the box and start cleaning up some of the day-to-day pain points that you guys have. So with that, Janae, I'm going to pass the baton back over to you, and we'll go from there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jeff. Appreciate that. All right, so just a reminder before I introduce our next speaker, if you have any questions for that amazing information that Jeff just shared with us, please use the GoToWebinar control panel. On the panel itself, there is a questions drop-down. You want to, it looks like Maggie found it. Thank you, Maggie. You want to use that to include any questions that you have on Jeff's presentation, as well as our next speaker. So our next speaker is Jacob Aguilar. Jacob started in the Salesforce ecosystem in May 2019 and is now working with Shift3 Technologies as a Salesforce certified administrator with an additional 4 Salesforce certifications under his belt. He has been able to improve and translate many business processes for Bitwise Industries into Salesforce with declarative building, automations, and web development skills. He is also an instructor by night at GeekWise Academy, helping formerly incarcerated individuals learn to be Salesforce admins. When Jacob is not at work, you'll find him at work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jacob.
Perfect. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. And is everyone seeing my screen? Just want to make sure before I start.
Yep, see the welcome.
Awesome. Perfect. So hi guys, as Janae mentioned, my name is Jacob Aguilar. I started back in the Salesforce ecosystem about May 2019. And just before that, I graduated from University of Phoenix with an emphasis in software engineering. And then shortly after that, I was taking web development classes at Geekwise Academy. And from there, I learned some JavaScript skills, Angular, just some various web development skills. And I was invited to be a part of this new Salesforce cohort, which, other than I knew Salesforce being a company, had no idea what I would be doing in there. But now, after a year in the ecosystem, I've been able to do so many great things to help businesses and Bitwise really improve their business processes and make them more efficient ultimately. So without further ado, kind of just get on here. This whole session is going to be learning about the different automations that exist in Salesforce, pick up some best practices in implementing each one, and considerations you need to take the time to think about when you start to implement each one. And then really some situations where each automation would be useful to use. Without further ado, here are some of the different types of automations that live inside of Salesforce. You have formulas, approval processes, workflow rules, and process builder, which I'll kind of touch on together because they're really similar in the way they work, flows, and then also triggers. And kind of just getting on, formulas. Formulas are kind of your first stop when you're making automations at Salesforce. There are calculations made on the record level. You can say, hey, formula field, look at some other fields on this current record and do something with those fields, either adding them up, attaching them together to make one text field. Really the sky's the limit when it comes to formulas, and you can use that creativity in lots of different places inside of Salesforce. And formulas in general are a vital tool for admins and devs alike because they show up in validation rules where you need to enforce data quality for your users. I try to shy away from validation rules as much as possible, but sometimes they are needed. Actions, you can use formulas and actions to really, like Jeff was showing before, a new contact. You can say, all right, when a new contact is made, take the existing account address information and put it into that new contact. Obviously, they have formula field as well on record. Then there's reports. You can use formulas and reports to do row level formulas, summary formulas, do calculations. You can even compare field to field and see what needs to be done or how you want to surface that information to your users. You can use formulas and workflows and processes, and then even flows themselves. So really, there's such a wide variety of places that formulas are used, and it really should be mastered. That way you can take full advantage of all of these different tools inside of Salesforce. Now, formulas can range from dead simple formulas, 2 + 2 = 4, X + Y = Z, or to stupidly complex. And time and date time fields, I'm looking at you. Sometimes you are a pain to deal with, but nonetheless, sometimes that is the business use case, and we got to adjust for that. Now, there is some considerations when you want to start building formulas. First off the bat, there is a character limit. You can't just have an endless formula going on forever. You are limited to 3,900 characters. And most of the time, I have found myself not even reaching this limit. So unless you're building a super complex formula, whatever you're doing, you most likely won't run into that, but it's just something to be aware of. Now, the next limit, the compile size limit, this is one you might run into more often. And, excuse me, basically, whenever you're building formulas, the maximum compile size you're allowed is 5,000 bytes. And this compile size limit is basically the size of the formula, including all the references to other formulas, any values and fields you're using. And an example where you might run into an issue with this is, let's say you have two formulas, Formula A and Formula B. And let's say Formula A is this super long, complex formula that does a lot of logic for your users. Then you have Formula B that references the first formula, Formula A. Now, when Salesforce runs and executes Formula B, the compile size is whatever formula A, whatever that size is, plus formula B. And you could run into issues where both of those together go over this 5,000 byte limit. So just being aware of that and knowing, okay, what can I do to reduce this compile size limit will help you in the long run. And some functions that significantly increase this limit or significantly increase the compile size are text functions, date value functions, and then the date time value functions as well. So this is just something to consider when you're building formulas. And finally, I kind of mentioned it before, how date time and time values are kind of difficult to work with formulas, and here's why. When you're working with date and time values in Salesforce, they don't return the number of hours or number of minutes in a logical format like we humans use every day. You can't just say, let's say you have a time field called start time, and you can't just say start time plus 7 hours to get 7 hours ahead of that start time. Date, time, and time calculations return a decimal number inside of Salesforce. So you need to understand how that works and how you can use that to add time to a time field. So for example here, time plus 7 divided by 24, because there is 24 hours in a day and you want to add 7 hours to that initial time field, would get you what you want. You want to equal time plus 7 hours. So just taking that into consideration and knowing how date and time calculations work will help you out in the long run as well. Now, their formulas are great. They are fantastic tools to use in your tool belt, and especially because you can reference a lot of different records and you can reach up to the parent records and pull values down. But referencing a parent record can sometimes be a double-edged sword, and here's why. A recent use case for a formula I had is with the Take Care program, where we're delivering grocery boxes to immunocompromised, elderly, and just people who just need food in general. We automate the number of grocery boxes that a case will get. Okay, all right. If the size of the family of a contact is 4 or less, they get 1 box. If it's 5 or greater, they get 2 boxes. So let's say a person submits a request for a grocery box, and at the time they state their size of the family is 4. All right, perfect. In Salesforce, the contact says the family is 4, and they get 1 box that time. But let's say during this whole pandemic, someone else comes to stay with them and their size of the family increases the next time they make a request 2 weeks later. And in Salesforce, we go update the size of the family field on the contact, and now it's 5. But what do you think happens to the previous case record or the previous request they made? The number of grocery boxes, because it was solely based on the size of the family on the parent contact record, that gets updated to 2. Even though when they made the request at the time, they only were allowed or shipped 1 box. So just being able to consider and take into consideration basically all how formulas are going to affect what data sets you're working with is going to come useful as you start building these complex automations. And in that case, you would lose all the historical data because you updated the size of the family on the contact. Now, some best practices when it comes to formula, and Jeff was even showing this when he was showing a formula as well, is styling. Let's say you write this formula on my screen, and 2 months later, you have to come back to this formula to edit it or update it in some way, shape, or form. Unless you're a robot, the most readable form of this formula is going to be on the right. You can see the functions are clearly capitalized. You can see I'm using in this formula the if and an is blank function. You can see the formula is not just one big long line. It's broken down into multiple lines. And then you're also indenting all your expressions and values you're using inside your formula. So just keep this in mind as you start to build more and more automations inside your org. You're not going to have a perfect recollection of what you decided to do the day you built this formula. And so being able to style your formula and in a readable fashion for your future self is going to become super handy for yourself. And now let's talk about some formula use cases. The kind of most obvious use case right off the bat is automating calculations based off other fields in your record. Maybe you have an opportunity with the close date and you want to display your users in just a really readable fashion, the number of days until this opportunity is expected to close. Or maybe you want to show your users the total cost of an item, A plus B equals C. Or maybe you're on a product, for example, and you need to calculate the discount a user is giving them and what the total cost of the product is after that discount. So this is some of the use cases you can use with formulas and just automating calculations in that fashion. Concatenation, just basically the simple act of putting two things together in a readable format. Let's say you have separate date and time fields, and you want to combine those in a one field for users to read, rather than having to look at two separate fields. Sky's the kind of limit in this case. We use this a lot when we are combining separate fields, and then we use that combined formula into Visualforce rather than having our developer combine those two fields in code. If you do it in a formula, any admin or any person knows what they're doing can go in after the fact and alter that formula, and no code has to be changed after that. Hyperlinks. We use formulas to create links to other systems based off details on their record. One such example of this in our hashtag coworkplace, we're tracking memberships, and we use a formula field to link that membership record to their membership record in Stripe. That way, our users can easily click on that link and be taken directly to their Stripe membership, and they'll do whatever they need to do in that system as well. Displaying images on a record detail, and Jeff kind of talked about this as well, where you can display images to show your users like easy to digest information. Maybe you want to show a green checkbox or a 3-signal traffic light based on the lead scoring. Hey, this lead comes from this source, has this information on it, display a green traffic light or a green check mark. You can use images to really display quick, easy to digest information to your users. And finally, there's this formula called Power of One, where it's a really simple formula. It's literally just a formula with number 1 in it. But this used to be a formula field you have to do on the record, but now you can do it inside of reporting and use row level formulas to do this. And you can calculate the number of unique records in a report. Maybe you want to find out the number of accounts each opportunity it's linked to. So you can use this formula to really digest your information much easier. And with that being said, let's move on to approval processes. Let's take a step back and let's think about our daily workflow lives. How many times have you had to get approval from your manager or a team? Maybe it's accounting, legal, finance, whomever. But consider how that approval process happens. You either email them, or maybe using Slack, you Slack them. You have to wait for them to hear back. And then ultimately, it's just a long, drawn out process to get word about either you're allowed to do some action or you're not. Salesforce already has a tool to tackle the situation. They're called approval processes. And ultimately, approval processes boil down to 3 key things: the sequence of steps that you want to that are required to approve a record, who the heck you want to request approval from, and then really what you want to do at each point in the process. So some considerations when you're building approval processes is that you can only trigger one approval process for each submission. And what I mean by that is, let's say your org has 10 approval processes, and one of your users submits a record for approval. That record can only route to one of those 10 approval processes. And let's say you accidentally overlap some criteria and you meant to send it to A approval processes, but instead of send it to Z. So just keeping these things in mind, you need to make sure your criteria, whenever you build approval processes, don't overlap with each other. That way you send your approvals to the correct process. Another consideration when you're building approvals, only objects that support queues will allow you to submit approval requests to queues, and we'll get into that in just a bit as well. And depending on how your business functions and your business processes, you may want to consider locking the record once it's been submitted for approval. Maybe a user submits a record to be approved, or an expense, a PTO request, who knows. And after the fact, they submit the approval, they go back and change some of those record details that the approver was going to use to gauge whether or not they should approve this record. That may alter their decision in approving so. So you may want to consider locking their record. That way, whomever that record is going to for approval, they get a clear snapshot of what they need to look at on their record before they make their decision. And finally, users with admin access can still edit records that were submitted for approval, even when they're locked. So it's just something to keep in mind. Now, here's just some best practices when you're building approval processes. Before you even touch and get into Salesforce, define your approvers. Who's going to be approving these records or these requests? Is it going to be a single user? Is it going to be their manager? Or is this going to be a team of people who have access to approve these requests, such as finance or legal, like accounting, I said before? And with that being said, if you are using a team, use a queue rather than submitting it to a single user. When you submit records for approval to a queue, any person that has access to that queue, John, Kelly, Mike, and accounting, they can access that queue and approve those requests from there, rather than it just routing to John from accounting. Build an email template whenever you're doing your approval processes. This will allow your users to not necessarily have to log into Salesforce every time they need to approve a request. They'll get an email on their phone or on their Gmail, whatever email application they're using, and they can just simply approve requests by responding approve or reject, and boom, that information is sent to Salesforce. And finally, some use cases with approval. Maybe you're working in sales and you have opportunities, and whenever you have an opportunity that's discounted more than 20%, you need to get your manager's approval. Rather than emailing or slacking him and waiting for his response, you can submit an approval request and boom, you'll find out the moment he clicks approve or reject, or they, whoever they are. Recruiting. Maybe you have a whole recruiting application inside Salesforce where you're tracking applications and candidates. And you can set up during this process several layers of approvals before an offer letter is officially sent out from Salesforce. That's also a cool use case to use approval processes. Let's say you're doing HR functions inside Salesforce and you want to require employees to submit PTO or time off requests and then have their manager approve it. This can all be done inside of Salesforce as well. And finally, let's say you're tracking expenses in Salesforce, and any expenses over $50 submit for a manager approval. And if it's over $5,000, I don't know what they're buying, but if it's over $5,000, for example's sake, require additional approval from 2 executives to approve that expense. So these are just some of the use cases to get you thinking about what you can do with approval process and ultimately shortening that business process of waiting on your manager or a team in your at your workplace to respond to an email or Slack. Put it in Salesforce and let Salesforce take care of it. Now, workflows and process builder. Workflows and process builder ultimately do very similar things, but I'll preface with this: workflow rules are kind of a thing of the past at this point. If your organization is still using workflow rules, I would heavily consider moving to process builder and even flow, which I'll kind of touch on in a bit as well. But process builder, like Jeff was showing, is a simple yet powerful tool to use to automate actions in a Salesforce. You saw when Jeff was building, it was a clear visual diagram of what the heck is supposed to happen. If X happens, do Y. And it was super easy to build and easy to deploy as well. Now, some considerations when you're building these workflow or these processes with Process Builder is if your use case if you need to send outbound messages to an external system, unfortunately, Process Builder can't do that yet at all. So you would still need to use a workflow rule to accomplish that use case. Process Builder can only have a maximum of 50 versions, 200 criteria nodes. I personally haven't run into these limits yet. But this is something to keep in mind. As your org matures, you may run into the situation, probably the version limit first, then the criteria node, where, okay, I run into the version limit. What do I do from here? Avoid generating infinite loops when you're building Process Builder. Because Process Builder can alter records, you can have ultimately two process builders. One, let's say you have process A that goes to update a field on a record, and you have process B that looks at that very same field that was updated and updates the field used for the criteria in process A. And depending on how your processes and automation set up, it is possible to generate an infinite loop. So just being aware of what automations live inside your org will help you prevent from generating infinite loops, and ultimately you'll get an error in the end and you'll be able to fix it and track it down. But it's just something you want to consider before you start building processes. Now, I kind of combine these two as well. Whenever you're building processes, make sure your immediate actions don't cancel out a scheduled action, because scheduled actions, they only remain in the queue to be sent out, or maybe it's an email or a chatter post. They only remain in the queue as long as the criteria for that scheduled action is valid. But let's say you have an immediate action that updates a field which is used as the criteria for a scheduled action, for an email alert to be sent out, or a task to be created with a sales rep. Those immediate actions could potentially cancel that scheduled action that was supposed to be sent out. So just keeping in mind what automations live inside that process and what scheduled actions you have will help prevent this as well. Now, here's some best practices when you're implementing Process Builder. Limit your org to 2 processes per object. Have one process for create and then one for create edit. That way you can accomplish all your use cases. If a record is created, do this. If a record needs to be edited and do some action, use the second process instead. When you're referencing record types, do not, and I repeat, do not reference the record type ID, because IDs change from sandbox to sandbox, org to org. If you try to deploy this process to a different sandbox or a different org, it is ultimately going to error out. Rather, what you should be doing is referencing the record type's developer name or the API name. In my experience, the developer name changes much less frequently than the label for that record type. It is possible to change the label without changing the API name. I probably wouldn't do it, but it is possible to happen. So when you're referencing that record type's developer name, you're guarding that process as much as possible. And let's say an action in your process sends out an email alert based on the email field in the record. In your criteria for that process, be sure to check if that email field is even populated in the first place. What's going to happen is, let's say you have an action to send out an email and the email field that it's using to send it to is blank. Your process is going to error out. So having a check for that in your criteria node will help prevent that. Let's say your criteria checks for values on a parent record. Let's say you have cases and contacts, and a contact can have many cases. And let's say you have some automation on cases. Let's say it's sending out emails based on the language of the contact. And if the contact's language is English, send out an English email. If the contact's language is Spanish, send out a Spanish email. But what do you think is going to happen when the lookup to that contact on that case record is null? That process is going to error out. So having that check first, see, all right, is the lookup field on the case object or the case record null? All right, if not, then let's check for the language on the contact and see which language they have. And finally, whenever you're using flows, or not flows, formulas inside a process builder, and you're trying to check if a value is null, use is blank instead of is null. Is blank is a better version of is null, and here's why. Is null can solely check for like lookup values, whereas is blank you can use to check if a text value is blank. You can't use is null to check if a text field is blank, because technically when there's nothing in a text field, it's just an empty string. An empty string is not technically null. And so therefore you may have some unintended consequences when you're trying to check if a text field is null. So rather than dealing with all that, use is blank and your life will be good. Now here's some use cases for Process Builder. And let's say you have a process on opportunity. Whenever a high value opportunity is won, automatically create a contract record, automatically post this to Chatter, and then email the VP of Sales about this deal that closed. And then after all those immediate actions, 6 days after, create a follow-up task for that sales rep who closed the deal to do X, Y, and Z, who knows? Or kind of connecting to approval processes here as well. Let's say going back to that opportunity discount approval process, automatically submit an opportunity for approval whenever the discount is greater than 20%. You can submit a record for approval inside a process builder, and boom, it's taking care of it for you, rather than relying on your users to submit that record for approval on their own, which they may forget sometimes. And then I find it funny because Jeff covered this use case in much more depth than I was going to right now. But if an account updates their address, update all its associated contacts addresses. That way they're all kept in sync as well. I see some support use cases. Let's say you're dealing with a customer community and a customer community member asks a question in the community. You can use Process Builder to automatically create a case record, and then in your support processes and how you handle that in your company, a service rep can respond to that case, and that case can be closed. And something we use here internally is when we're supporting our users. So let's say a user submits a case to us for about a Salesforce issue. Whenever a new Salesforce issue case is submitted, it automatically emails our whole admin team. That way we can get that issue resolved quickly. Now on to flows. Flows are, not gonna lie, are kind of my area of interest and my expertise. I love flows, I love building them. I would consider myself a flow addict. And you can actually watch a previous flow presentation I did in Trailblazer series as well about flows. But flows are very powerful and robust tools inside of Salesforce. And there's tons of changes coming to flows in this next release from in summer 20. Traditionally in flows, we had two types of flows. We had auto launch flows and screen flows. Now, and previously as well, when you had auto launch flows, you can choose to schedule that flow to run daily, weekly, or monthly. You can choose to have that flow launch from Process Builder, or you can even have those flows just trigger on record changes. But now this is going to be different coming in summer 20. You're going to have different types of flow templates you're going to be able to choose from. There's going to be scheduled flows, and whenever you want a flow to run on its own without any user intervention, daily, weekly, or monthly, this is going to be your best bet. Record change flows is probably going to be our biggest change coming to flow soon. We're going to be able to skip the whole process builder step when trying to trigger a flow. Record change flows are going to allow us to trigger a flow directly from the flow itself and skip that whole previous step. Auto launch flows are somewhat remain the same thing, and then screen flows are also going to remain similar to what they were before. And flows really are the future of automation side of Salesforce. I would highly encourage you to start learning them if you haven't already. And this is straight from the summer 20 release. They said you can replace most of your workflows and record change processes that you create inside a Process Builder with flows. And so really it seems like this is going to be the resource they're going to be heavily developing in the future. So learning it now will put you one step ahead of the game. Now, before you even start building flows, you need to consider how in the heck are my users going to interact with this flow, if at all, depending on what your business use case is. Do my users need a step-by-step process to guide them through a use case? If so, screen flows are going to be your best bet. Does something need to happen weekly at a certain time? Scheduled flows will be your best bet there. So just considering the use case of each flow and how ultimately it's going to interact with your users is going to dictate which flow type you're going to use. User access. You need to determine what records your user has access to, what profile, permission sets, and org-wide defaults are in your org, and then what records this flow is going to alter. Ultimately, let's say you're building a screen flow and if user doesn't have access to edit certain types of records, or maybe it's a record owned by someone else, your flows can error out. There are ways around this now where you can say, hey, flow, run in a system context, but enforce record level sharing. Or you can even tell your flow, hey, run in a system context and don't enforce record level sharing, which means it's gonna be able to access whatever record and fields it needs to. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're building flows. And finally, this kind of applies when you're handling larger data sets, but you have transaction limits and flows, much like Apex as well. So the records you can process as a result of DML statements, which are just create, update, delete, and get, is 10,000 records. And so just depending on how large your data set is and what you're dealing with, you may want to consider these limits as well. Records retrieved by SOQL queries. You can retrieve 50,000 records from a get records per transaction. So again, depending on how large data set your flow is going to be dealing with, this is something you want to consider as well, and bulkify your flow as much as possible. Now, for those of you who watched my previous flow presentation, you may recognize this slide from it because this is still the best practices I use and I teach others when building flows. But your first step in building flows is document, describe in detail what the heck this flow is doing. On the flow description, provide a short description of what this flow is accomplishing. For each node in your flow, describe what this node is doing and how it ultimately is impacting the flow. How is this node being used elsewhere in the flow? And then whenever you're naming variables, keep a consistent naming scheme. If you're using Pascal case, which you're just capitalizing every first letter of the words, keep that consistent with the whole flow, and better yet, all your flows inside your org. Use a decision element after a get element to check for no results. So let's say you have a get records node inside your flow, and you're getting all the contact records that meet a certain criteria. I don't know what criteria you're looking for, but you're meeting a criteria. But what's going to happen is when you have a get records that returns no records, and ultimately somewhere else in the flow you're trying to update those records that were initially retrieved, it's going to error out. Whereas if you applied a decision element after a get record saying, all right, check if my original query for these records returned null. If it was null, go down this path instead. And if it wasn't null, proceed with the rest of the flow. This is kind of very similar to what I was talking about with the record type IDs and Process Builder. Never hard code IDs inside of flows, because for the same use case, IDs are different from org to org, from sandbox to sandbox. And when you try to hard code IDs, it is going to fail in other instances of Salesforce. Don't put any data modification, oh my God, I can't speak, data modification language statements inside of a loop. So any create, update, get, or delete nodes inside of a loop. That is a surefire way, depending on how big your data set is as well, that you're going to run through all your transaction limits. Use fault paths when you're building flows. Let's say you have an update records node when you're building a flow, and if that for some reason update records fails, you can define a separate path. Maybe you go to a separate screen saying, hey, this failed, contact your administrator to find out the details. You can use fault paths to kind of error handling and error checking inside your flows. Use subflows when you're able to build flows. Because flows can reference other flows, you can build tiny component flows that do certain actions for you. And that way, when you build larger flows, you can use these components whenever you can to help shorten your building process. And finally, use the debugger when you're building flows. Debugger is a great tool to help you track down what is happening step by step and variable by variable inside your flow. And if ultimately you run into an issue, you can see exactly where it's going wrong. Now here's some use cases for flows. Our recent use case, for a step-by-step kind of wizard, is for our leasing department. We have, and whenever you rent out a space, we have to do a move in and move out walkthrough with you through the space. And they were tracking this all on pieces of paper. And we all know you can lose paper wherever you go. I tend to lose all the notepads and sticky notes I always write down. I have no idea where they go, but they always seem to end up lost. Well, now this is all in Salesforce. We have this screen flow that allows our leasing department to do all these walkthroughs and saves them inside of Salesforce for them. That way we know all this information is up to date and accurate. For our GeekWise Academy, our coding academy school at Bitwise, it used to be a tiresome and tedious process to update the website for every new round of classes, whereas now we have a user that uses a ScreenFlow to create the next round of class records, and then our Visualforce page is able to pull those records automatically from Salesforce, and it does it all for them. They don't have to no longer go one by one in the website and update those classes. Any automated processes and flows. So one recent use case is I have a flow that's scheduled to run daily at 1 a.m. in the morning when no users are on, and it automatically creates time slot records, allowing a guest site user to schedule an appointment time to pick up a grocery box. Or let's say a tenant e-signs their contract for their space at Bitwise. We automatically create a new lease record and then attach that newly signed lease agreement file to that new record as well. So you can really see how flows can automate a lot of processes and even complex business processes inside of Salesforce. And finally, we have triggers. Triggers are probably the most robust tool you can use in automation. And part of the reason for that is because they can run on deletion and undeletion. Let's say a user deletes a record, and you can have a trigger run whenever a record is deleted. And let's say to go to recycle bin and undelete that record. You can also have the trigger run on undeletion as well. And there are two types of triggers. You have before triggers, which fire just before a record is inserted or updated in Salesforce. And you have after triggers that kind of, as you guess, run after a record is created or saved inside of Salesforce. But as much as triggers are extremely powerful and robust, they should be your last ditch effort to automation. You need to consider, can I do this with the formula? Can I do this with the process? Can I do this with the flow before turning to triggers? Because this is going to create more technical debt inside your org. Now, some considerations when you're using triggers inside your org. Triggers run in a system context, which means they're going to be able to update records that users don't necessarily have access to. So that's just something to keep in mind. Triggers can't reference external APIs all on their own. What you instead need to do is build a separate batch class that makes all those API callouts to whatever API you're using, and then your trigger will reference that separate batch class. And that way, every time a record is created or updated, those API calls are able to happen. Triggers can't trigger other triggers. And this is kind of going back to the previous example with, or consideration with Process Builder. It is possible to generate loops with triggers. So knowing what automations and what triggers you have inside of your org will help you prevent creating infinite loops or unintended effects when you're building these automations. And finally, this is just something to keep in mind, is most automations and triggers included will fire on data imports. So keeping in mind when you're importing thousands of records, knowing your trigger is going to fire may be a benefit or a detriment to you. So that's just something you need to keep in mind when you're importing record sets. Now, some best practices when you're using triggers. Use trigger handlers. In general, what you're going to have is one general trigger handler that handles all these all the logic and methods. Then you'll have one trigger handler per object, and that trigger handler per object will reference that general trigger handler, and then inside your actual trigger, you'll reference whatever object trigger handler you're using. Have conditions in your trigger so your trigger doesn't necessarily fire unneeded blocks of code. Maybe you have a condition inside your trigger that checks for X, Y, and Z criteria. And if it doesn't meet that criteria, don't run the rest of the trigger. What's the point of running the rest of the trigger if it's not going to do anything? This is going to save you process time instead of Salesforce. And finally, use record types when you're applying triggers to certain objects. So let's say you have an object inside of Salesforce that is used by multiple business units, but you're only making a trigger to affect one of those business units. If you don't specify a record type, and let's say all those business units have separate and needed record types, if you don't specify a record type in that trigger is going to run for all the records inside that object. And maybe that's not what you want. So that's something you need to keep in mind. If you have an object with multiple record types, do I want this trigger to run on every single record that is created or updated or deleted inside that object? And some use cases for triggers. Jeff was kind of talking about this before when you wanted to roll up the number of contacts to an account. And some of the use cases here, and for our grocery delivery program, we count the number of box requests this person has made in the past 30 days. And then after that, we have some other logic and automation on the back end using flows and process builder to do X, Y, and Z. Or let's say you want to determine how many deliveries and shops a volunteer has made throughout delivering groceries, and then how many of those are currently active right now, depending on the status field. I mentioned before how triggers can't handle API calls on their own. You need to reference a separate class to do so. So this is one of the use cases. Let's say we're using the Slack API in this first one. If a contact Slack email is added or changed, reach out to Slack and update all the Slack and information and picture fields with the Slack API on the contact record. Or let's say if an address field changes on a custom object, whenever that is added or changed, reach out with the Here API and grab that geolocation and county data and put it back onto the record. And then from there, we'll do some other processes in the background. And then also, this is just a general trigger we have in our org, converting attachments to files on the fly. Let's say for some reason, somehow, one of us admins or a user makes an attachment inside of Salesforce. Because notes and attachments are kind of going away and we should be moving to notes and files, we have a trigger that automatically takes an attachment, converts it into the file, then deletes the previous attachment. That way we're not duplicating data inside of our org. But other than that, that's pretty much what I had planned for you guys. Here's some resources that I use when putting this presentation together. This is mostly from Salesforce Help and documentation, some blogs from Salesforce Ben, as well as some Trailhead modules. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Janae, and that is it. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks so much, Jacob. That was amazing. A lot of really good information. So as I have been sharing with you, now it is time for our Q&A. So we have a few questions that we have for both of you. Just want to make sure, Jeff, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. All right. So first question. If I am building a roll-up over lookup, wait, what? Hold on. If I am building a roll-up over lookup, how do I decide between using a flow or a trigger?
Got it. I know what the question is. So if you are building it's a roll-up field, a roll-up calculated field for counting statistics. The issue comes into place where it's based on the number of records and the load that it takes to do the calculation. You can definitely use flow to do some lightweight roll-up calculations, but they eventually break if you have a lot of data. So the choice is just really based on the volume of data, and you don't necessarily know how much data is going to take to actually break it. But typically, if it's under 1,000 records that you're trying to statistically count, in theory, you could use flow to do that. But I would recommend using Apex or triggers for calculated stats.
Great. Anything to add to that one, Jacob?
I think also you can also look on the App Exchange for products that do roll-up over lookups. I know there's two one's called Roll-Up Helper and one's called Declarative Lookup Roll-Up Summaries, if I remember correctly. And you can also do those roll-up over lookups that way as well.
Awesome. Second question, can I use workflow rules to solve the address sync issue?
The short answer is no. You can solve pieces of the problem with workflow, but my recommendation at this point, kind of like the argument of do you use Classic versus Lightning, is workflow rules are pretty much on their way out the door. And Process Builder has so much more maturity to it, and it's visually friendly, almost self-documenting in a sense. So my recommendation today going forward is to stop the use of workflow rules, even though it's deceptive that you can do certain things with it. Process Builder is the replacement and the preferred solution.
All right. When Summer 20 deploys to production orgs, should I start translating our record change processes to flows?
That is a great question. And that's something we're kind of still asking ourselves as a team. But ultimately, what I would do in that case is analyze what processes you have in your org currently and how many of those are record change processes. From there, like, you need to determine what is the level of effort to translate those processes to workflows, and what benefits would that migration even serve your org. If you're not getting really any tangible benefits, then maybe consider keeping those processes as processes. But if there's something that you are able to do with Flow that you couldn't do in a process, and making that migration would help that, then maybe consider doing so. So short answer, kind of depends. I would just look at your processes and go from there.
Okay. All right. I inherited an org that is in complete disarray automation-wise. There are workflow rules, processes, flows, and triggers galore. How do I even figure out where to start untangling this mess? Sounds like a common question for both of you.
Jacob, you want to take this one?
Yeah. So first off, I'm sorry. To be frank with you, this is going to be a tough task ahead of you, but a good place to begin. And assuming all these automations are still working well and there's no major complaints with your users, start cataloging what automations you have, what objects and fields they touch. From here, you can map out which automations are affecting your biggest business units inside your org, and then just begin to consolidate those. What workflow rules can I migrate to processes? Or even what workflows can even migrate to flows when Summer 20 goes live? What triggers can be rewritten as flows or processes, so that way any admin going forward can update those processes as needed. From here, I would just work your way down and just understand what automations are in place and why they're there. So that's my advice. But
if I can tack onto that and kind of reinforce that micro iterative game plan, I've inherited orgs over the years. And even I'm overwhelmed and scared to even make a change or move. And it feels like it's a lot of work to analyze everything. Just pick a corner of the world and start in. Maybe take the easiest object that has 1 or 2 triggers or a couple of rules and clean that up and get comfortable with what's going on and work your way through it in small compartments. You don't have to take and analyze the entire environment to start cleaning the house in this particular case. So hopefully the micro iterative mindset would help you not feel so overwhelmed in an org like that. That's how you dig out.
definitely.
And lots of hope. Okay, last question. How do I know if Process Builder will break if I have too many contact records? Man, you guys got some tough questions today.
That one's always an interesting one, and some of the stuff that Jacob kind of touched on comes into play. It isn't always an exact science. When you hit governor limits or you hit timeout issues with Salesforce, which we will eventually hit, or even formula compilation issues, sometimes you don't discover them until people have used the system for quite some time. You're not always going to have a full sandbox with the ability to put in, hundreds of thousands of records to test. So the problem with it is it's a crazy calculation that you can't really do without trying or testing or working with it, because a trigger might add load and then cause it to time out. And so you'll just have to kind of look at the object, like the contact object, and see if there's triggers and extra load or weight, or just see if it times out or is too slow. So it's a little bit of a process of experimentation and testing, and hoping that you've got everything. So hope is a little bit of a strategy, but you ultimately will figure out the number of records and stuff like that. But there's a lot of headroom nowadays in Process Builder and Flow, so it's getting better, is all I can say.
Great. All right. Jacob, do you have any questions for Jeff? Jeff, Jacob? Seems like there were some hard ones in there, so I commend you both.
No problem.
All right. Well, thank you guys for your presentations today. I'm sure we'll get some questions via email later, but I want to kind of shift, that was not meant to be a joke, or clever. Want to direct our attention over to Amber Wood, our business development manager for Shift3 Technologies that specializes in Salesforce, to tell you a little bit about Shift3 Technologies. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Amber.
Thank you, Janae. Thank you so much for staying for the final portion to learn a little bit more about Shift3. I can't decide if I need to go over it again, as many of you heard me on unmute rehearsing part of that earlier, and that is just a little bit of humility for my morning. But in any case, I will walk through it again for you. So in order to understand a little bit more about Shift3, we'd have to take a step back and look at our larger company, which is Bitwise Industries. And Bitwise Industries started about 7 years ago. And the concept of Bitwise Industries is to bring technology to areas that are underserved communities to revitalize those areas. And it was really previously thought that bringing a technology company or starting a technology in areas like Fresno, that you would essentially hit a critical mass and go elsewhere to really build up your business. And the founders of Bitwise really wanted to stop that. And in order to do that, they started a three-pronged approach that's infrastructure, workforce, and industries. And infrastructure is the first portion of that, and that is our real estate division of Bitwise, and it's the actual physical buildings that are managed and maintained by Bitwise. They are the rallying points for that technology. They're only leased out to technology companies to keep that growing in the communities, and it's really sending a message to the companies that yes, you can build and grow a successful technology company in the Central Valley. And we've done that in Fresno, Bakersfield, Merced, and there's plans of building into additional communities as well. The second component of that is our workforce. And obviously, in order to fulfill a problem of having world-class technology, you really need to have that key component, and that's the people. So the developers, coders, Salesforce admin. And that is where the portion of workforce developed GeekWise Academies, which Jacob talked about a little bit earlier. And that's the leading vocational and technical training school for coders and developers in the United States today. So we are really growing that local pool of talent and resources for those companies to pull those individuals from. And as well, we're also taking that opportunity within GeekWise to be able to prepare individuals for the workforce. The third portion of that is the industries portion, and that is all of the companies with under Bitwise that they've started, which is Shift3, Bitwise Adventures, OrderSlip, to name a few. And these are the places these individuals are working and growing into a career and producing other technologies. Again, all that really just funneling in together, those three, to be able to show the world that yes, we can provide and produce world-class technology from these underserved communities. And we've been doing that successfully now for 7 years. So just to dive in a little bit more to Shift3 Technologies, is we are a local based California company, although I am in the San Diego area with everyone here. All of our resources are in the same area. So we are a certified Salesforce implementation partner, adhering to all of the Salesforce implementation standards. We have all sorts of certifications across the board on our team. We have an in-house team that has the capability to work on complex and diverse projects with all of those varying levels of degrees. And we're very proud that we, through GeekWise Academies, that we really believe in a constant investment in our admins and our developers of educating them. So we subscribe to the philosophy of constant learning so that our team is with the latest and greatest information to be able to provide that knowledge when we work with clients. Just to take you quickly through our team, that is Irma Olguin Jr. in the top left-hand corner, and she is the founder of Bitwise as well as the CEO of Shift3 Technologies. there is Janae in the right-hand corner, our director of marketing, who put this wonderful presentation together and brought all of you here. Then the other two individuals are on the development side, and Chris is really focused on the production of projects that we have in the pipeline, and he's the client-facing individual, consistently working with our clients to make sure their goals and objectives are met. Corey, meanwhile, is really our back end. The internal process is where his focus is, making sure that we're growing and evolving and really providing the best possible experience across the board for the internal team to be able to work with Chris and the client. For the Shift 3 sales team, JP Prendergast is our director of sales for both the custom software as well as the Salesforce side of Shift 3. And then below that, that is me, and I am the point person that's really working customer facing with our clients. Just take you briefly through the Shift 3 advantage, and really our biggest assets that we feel is our approach and our customer engagement process that's been tried and tested for the 7 years. So it's a process that we've really started in 7 years ago and honed in to really what we feel is most successful in working with our clients. And I'm going to dive into that a little bit more in a couple slides. That other component is project competency, our end-to-end capability. So, you know, our Salesforce team that's in-house, the expertise, the certifications across the different disciplines that I had mentioned previously, and that we're also really out of low-cost Fresno, so our prices are very competitively priced to meet our clients' needs as well. This is just a little bit about our services, and the bottom is our custom software services. So for the purposes of this presentation, just want to take you through the Salesforce offerings. And Shift 3 is a Salesforce partner that we are offering a full range of professional services for Salesforce consulting. So the first portion is implementation. We have a successful track record in new implementation, so a full rollout of working with Salesforce within our client to be able to dig in and provide best practices, create user adoption. So the full rollout is something that we're well versed in. Then if you move over to Salesforce Consulting, this is where we as a team offer custom development, integration, data migration, to name a couple of those that we've been working on with our in-house team for a few years now. And the last portion of that I want to touch on is what we find one of the most important but most overlooked areas of investment on a project, and that is something that we're well versed in, and that's strategy of user adoption. So we provide change management to have your Salesforce users love Salesforce, but also know how to adequately use it and leverage it so that it works for them and you maintain that user adoption. The last one is staff augmentation, managed services, which we are heavily focused in really helping overworked admins to be able to offload some of that work, some of the more day-to-day work that they want to get to some larger projects that they will utilize a full-time or part-time certified admin from our team to help them out, as well as we can provide bridging the gap when a company is looking for a full-time admin. So these are just some of our services, and I hope that outlines what we provide. This is what I was talking earlier about that we really feel is the ideal customer journey and what separates us. And this is something that you can look at for the Salesforce journey, or really it could be applicable to any type of sales process that we feel really is a successful approach for rolling out a project. And so just to take you through that, the first portion of that is engage. And what engage is where that first meeting happens, and you want to ensure that it's a good partnership right off the bat. do we align, make sure that there is clearly a rapport. You would want to like the person that you're working with. It's a long-term commitment. Does this individual, does this company have the technical acumen to execute your vision or help coach you to reach your goals? Once that phase is complete, we would move into Immerse, which is really where we come in with our technical team and listen to the client. And we don't come in with our own agenda. It's really looking to see what are their objectives, what are their concerns, understand goals, the project timeline, really candid about our abilities in that first technical meeting. Once we've moved from that technical meeting, we would go into Envision, and Envision is that moment where we create the big picture solution. So the scope of work is created, and we provide that roadmap for the team to keep coming back to, is that universal truth from both the client side as well as our project team. Once we've moved and agreed upon the scope of work, we would move into Execute, and our team adheres to an agile process methodology where we would start and work on a regular cadence with our client. So if that's every 2 weeks of a check-in, if that's every 1 week, depending on the particular project, to really establish protocols. And within Execute, we would also be going back and forth between Validate. So every time we execute, we want to validate, and then we go back and we execute something, we want to validate. So it's just in between that stage until we would move on to that final stage, which is delivery. So that is when user acceptance takes place. It's testing before the deployment. So really adoption, kicking the tires. At this point, we've moved from key stakeholders onto our users. And once that has been accepted, that's the full delivery. And then we continue to collaborate as partners. And I hope that illustrates the process of what we feel is really the ideal customer methodology for a Salesforce project, as well as any other type of project. And I just want to, at this point, hand it over back to Janae, and thank you so much for your time.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Amber. All right, so we have come to the end of our session for today. I appreciate everyone sticking in with us and getting all that great information that Jeff and Jacob had to offer for us. I want to invite you to our next webinar in the California Trailblazer series, which is next Thursday, I'm already jumping to July, guys, June 11th. It will be at 9 a.m. Once again, we are heading up north to Sacramento. Our keynote will be from Shannon Gregg, and we'll have a training session from David Aquina. So encourage you to head on over to the caltrailblazers.com website and get registered for that one. Also, I will be sending out an email at the conclusion of today's webinar, which will include links to not only today's full presentation deck, but also the recording of the entire webinar. I will also invite you, for those that have not had a chance to attend one of our webinars yet this year, we would like to send you a gift. So if you want to reply to the email that I send out later today with your mailing address, I would love to ship out a gift for you attending our California Trailblazer Series webinar. So with that, I wish you all a great day and a great weekend ahead. I'm giving you 7 minutes of your life back, so I hope everyone gets up and stretches and maybe gets a breath of fresh air outside. Have a great day. Bye-bye.